What are native bees and how do they interact with native plants? Today, we're really delighted to meet with Dr. Sean Griffin, Director of Science and Conservation at the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, to hear what he's discovered in his restoration-focused research. Dr. Griffin, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks, John.
Today, we're going to talk about some pollinators, but first I want to back up and talk about your focus as a researcher at the center and what are some of the projects that y'all are looking at right now?
Yeah, so as a restoration ecologist, working at the Wildflower Center is kind of amazing because we have this long legacy of restoration-focused research. So our biggest project is this 25-year study that was established by Dr. Mark Simmons to understand land management and how to manage our land in central Texas. And this study was set up to look at the effects of prescribed burning across 3 different seasons, as well as mowing and other restoration techniques, because fire historically would have been a really important driver of plant communities across Texas, especially in this time where we're seeing a lot of drought and changes in the environment. We're able to use this long-term data set to understand how we should better manage our lands and how we expect plants and other animals, animals to respond. Talking about pollinators, we're able to use this long-term data set to understand how what we do on the land and how everything is changing is affecting the plants that pollinators use for food.
When we talk about pollinators, though, we aren't necessarily just talking about bees, correct?
Yeah, so pollinators is kind of this umbrella term that we use to describe any animals that provide pollination services to plants. And so pollination is the transport of pollen from one flower to another. It enables plant reproduction. And bees are probably our most important pollinators for most plants because they're evolved for a life with plants. They have specialized hair to carry pollen. But they're not the only pollinators. What a lot of people don't realize is that actually a lot of flies are really important pollinators, especially in times of year when it's cold or rainy, when it's not good conditions for bees. Moths and butterflies can also serve as pollinators. They're often not as hairy as bees. They're not adapted to that life. But they can carry pollen really long distances, and they're also evolved to specialize in certain plants.
I've seen some pretty hirsute moths, though.
That's true. That's true. Some of the moths are better, and actually, to some extent, it's not understood how important moths are to pollination. So it's kind of interesting. Another pollinator that we really love here in Texas are the hummingbirds. And hummingbirds is something that we're thinking about a lot with our work right now because some of our rarest plants in Texas are actually evolved to be pollinated by hummingbirds and other animals that you wouldn't think of as pollinators. You can always tell a hummingbird plant versus a plant that's evolved to have bee pollinators because bees actually can't see red. To them, it looks gray because they don't have, or looks like a different color because they don't have those receptors.
A lot of people are worried about colony collapse with honeybees. Those are European honeybees. But really, your focus, I presume, is really a bit more on the native bees. What's the difference between sort of honeybees and our native bees? Because those are solitary, right?
Yeah, it's a great question. So honeybees, like you mentioned, are a non-native species that were brought in from Europe. They're really important for our agriculture, and there was this big campaign with colony collapse and other diseases to save the bees. But what people didn't really realize through all of that is that the honeybees and the number of honeybees that we have in the US are actually largely dictated by markets. And so if honeybees are affected by disease, farmers will actually compensate and raise more colonies, they'll increase the prices. So we just don't worry as much about the honeybees beyond agriculture. What we study in our work is the native bees. They're not all solitary, but a lot of them are solitary. These bees, actually we have 4,000 in the United States.
Wow.
And Texas has some of the highest native bee diversity in the country. I think one of the highest diversities even in the world. We have over 1,000 species just in Texas. And a lot of these are highly specialized. Some of them will only come out for short periods of time. And working in place with this kind of bee diversity is really motivating because we really want to protect these really interesting species.
There's so many bees that what they just found a new species with the blue mining bee that's only in Oklahoma and Texas.
It's incredible that we're still discovering species like that.
What's sort of the habitat that people, if they want to attract these native bees, what do they need to be looking at within their landscape?
So a lot of the bees that I'm thinking about these days are the bumblebees. A lot of these are not specialized, and you may not think that they're in danger because people are really used to seeing them around the garden. But bumblebees, especially in central Texas, are one of our most important bees for pollination of native plants. So they are large, they're hairy, they make these colonies and they forage a lot of the year. And so a lot of plants are adapted specifically to these bees as one of the most important pollinators in the system. Another thing about bumblebees is that they require large amounts of habitat in order to survive. So some of the other solitary bees, like sweat bees, may not need as much habitat in order to thrive. But bumblebees need an acre or more of good habitat in order to survive. And so this means that in the city, you'll actually see areas that may not have enough habitat to support them, and you won't see the bumblebees. It's a good indicator of, neighbors or communities having green space if you see bumblebees around. So what I really encourage people to think about is that every yard can be part of that habitat.
Right.
It may not be the entire habitat for any given bee, but you're kind of joining with your community and creating this network of community that bees can use to thrive.
Right. So you don't just have to have an acre of land.
No.
If it's collectively with everybody's incorporating a little bit of habitat, that adds up pretty quick. Some of our native bees like bare ground. As gardeners, we tend to think of bare ground as an anathema or something.
Yeah.
But and then I've also heard you leave those stems out. Maybe if you cut them back to a third, they'll eventually go away between all the stuff that's growing. But those stems will have some of those nesting bees come up and set up and lay their eggs in those hollow stems. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I think the thing to consider with encouraging native bees in your yard or your land in general is to have a diversity of resources as much as possible. So that's a diversity of flowers, lots of different species, ideally native plants that they're adapted to, but also a diversity of different nesting habitats. So like you're saying, having stems, try to leave some of those pithy stems up through the winter. Those are great homes for bees. Also have some areas of your yard, it doesn't have to be your whole yard, but some areas that you leave bare, some areas where you leave some litter, because there's such a diversity of bees, again, here in Texas, that they all have a diversity of requirements. And a lot of the bumblebees actually will nest in bunches of grass or in areas in abandoned mouse nests. And so it's really important to leave some areas that may have some woody material to create those nesting habitats for bumblebees.
What's your take on bee houses?
So I am pro if you're able to take care of them. So there's been a lot of really good work on bee hotels and that kind of nesting habitat. And what they find is if you have those in your yard, you have those in your community, it's creating nesting resources that may not exist otherwise. So that's really important. But if you leave them out for long periods of time, they can build up disease and parasite loads. And so that means that it's important to regularly, maybe every year or two, switch out the materials in those bee hotels. Just to back up and explain what they are, they're usually these wooden boxes or some sort of box that's filled with either bamboo or some sort of tube that bees, solitary bees, can go in and make nests, lay their eggs, and then usually they overwinter in there. The young bees develop and then fly out in the spring, which means that if you catch them after they fly, sometime in the early summer or midsummer, then you can actually switch those nests out and replace them with other two.
Sean, thank you so much for coming in today. It's been, we've gone over a lot of material, but I know people are going to be excited to really get in and start to create some wonderful bee habitat.